So today will be two speakers. I will be moderating the webinar. My name is George. We will have with us two colleagues from the NVGL, Maurice Voss and Gwen Priska. We are all experts in the area of energy and markets, as you can see, and we have some experience or extensive experience in due diligence process, where we're going to focus on this webinar. Next slide, please. The agenda, I will start with some housekeeping rules to tell you how this is going to work. Then I'm going to introduce the model of that we have developed for project maturity level for our projects and where the due diligence will play a role here. And then we will move for the webinar itself, talking about the due diligence, ending up with lessons learned from project developers. So we will introduce what are the parts involved, what is the due diligence, what types of risks are assessed, and giving some examples in the meantime. We will end up with some question and answer session, so we will have a lot of time to place your questions. Next slide, please. As housekeeping rules, just let you know that you are all muted by default because of the background noise, but we want to hear your feedback and your questions. So we will have time for it. There are two ways that you can put your questions. During the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and we will try to unmute you so that you can make your question live. Or you can use the chat box anytime and place the question there. If we do not have time to answer all your questions, we will come back to you via email and answer the question for sure. Again, please note that this webinar is being recorded. Next slide, please. So what is the EIP-SCC stands for? The EIP-SCC is the European Innovation Partnerships on Smart Cities and Communities. Basically, is a marketplace or the marketplace of smart cities, where you can find all the information that is relevant on this space, bringing together cities, industries, SMEs, investors, research, and other smart cities actors. And this is being set up by the European Commission. Next slide, please. The EIP-SCC has three parts or three phases that we divided. It's the explore, shape, and deal. Explore is basically where you can find all the information that is related with past projects, best practice, quantitative and quality information. So you can find even in the marketplace or the Smart Cities Information System. Both of them are part of the EIP-SCC, and you will find a lot of information about what is in the market, what has been done as good examples, so that you can see and use it for your own. Then there is the shape part, where we have action clusters and working groups and initiatives. So basically, those are volunteer groups that are working together around a certain subject that is related with the smart city space, and helping to improve the projects and helping to improve the market to lead to more business. Also on this part, there are regular workshops and webinars such as this one. And then we have the deal part, where we focus more. This deal part has matchmaking events with investors. So what we try to do is to support cities on the development of their projects. We have open calls for that. If you Google EIP-SCC, you will find out in our website an open call for projects, where you can submit your project. We will take a look, and then we will match you with a pool of investors that we have gathered in our investor network that is also available in our website. So I invite everyone to Google EIP-SCC, visit us, and learn a little bit more about what we do. Next slide, please. So what we have developed is a framework of project maturity level so that we can rank the projects in terms of maturity as regards to their bankability. Bankability is a term that is used by the investors and financiers to understand whether the project is ready to be investable or somehow needs other to be changed in somehow. We go from PML1, where we just have a potential project that has been identified, to PML6, where that project is ready to be financed or ready to launch the tender. And you see that in the middle there are several phases that goes from says that the project has been quantified. That means that we have some data about the project. The project has a business model identified, which is very relevant. Business case has been developed, it's investor ready, and then it's open for the tender. What we do on the projects that are submitted via our calls for projects, we rank those projects in one of these PMLs, and then we try to help that project to move from one PML to another. And this process that we try to do is somehow related with the due diligence process. What we are trying to do, we are not doing a due diligence, to be clear, but we use the principles of the due diligence to check, based on the checklist that we have, to check whether your project can move from one PML to another, and then we will point you saying, for instance, your project is a PML3. To move for PML4, you need to develop your business case better. So please find this information that is available in our websites, and please contact people from our action clusters that they can help you develop those business case, so that we are pointing people to the right place, and then if they change their project accordingly, they will probably move for a PML 4 and then 5 and so on, until we have that project ready to be launched. So that's the work that we develop on EIP-SCC, and it's related with this due diligence process. But I will move for my colleagues from DNVGL that will present you what is due diligence, what is the relevance of due diligence, because as you will hear, that's the process that the investor will do to make sure that your project comply with their requirements and the risks are under control. Next slide, please. So I will hand it over now for my colleagues from DNVGL. The floor is yours.
Thank you, George. So I propose to start immediately with what a due diligence is, because we actually got quite a lot to cover today. The first slide that I want to discuss with you is to explain what a due diligence is. And in preparing for this webinar, I had a look at the dictionary, and it comes up with the following definition, which says that it's a comprehensive appraisal of a business which is being undertaken by a prospective buyer, especially to establish its assets and liabilities and evaluate its commercial potential. Well, in my view, this definition is actually pretty complete, but I can understand that it's also very abstract. And I think the aim of this webinar is to clarify what the due diligence process is a bit further. So I suggest that we start with what the objectives are of a due diligence. I think the first objective, that is the most important one, is to obtain all the information that is required to appropriately value the target company that the buyer envisages to acquire. The second point is to identify the potential risk and possibly opportunities and the mitigating measures that may be related to the acquisition of the other company. And this relates, of course, also to the assets and liabilities in the definition that has been put on this slide. Third objective could be to provide additional information that is included in the transaction deal terms. So these are the preconditions on which a deal would take place. And a fourth objective could be to identify showstoppers, early on in a process, which are major risks that allow or that makes a prospective buyer move away from acquiring the company. And on the other hand, there are red flags. The red flags are also large risks, but they require further scrutiny in a further due diligence process. And I will come back to that later on as well. And finally, the due diligence study is being reported in a report, and a due diligence report may serve as input to the decision makers, but it may also be submitted to potential other lenders if you require more funds to acquire the other company. So we can say that a due diligence is part of a transaction process, and we will distinguish two different transaction processes in this webinar. On the one hand, we have a merger and acquisition, which is where an existing company would acquire another existing company. And the other one is a project finance situation where a new project is being constructed. And for this project, a separate company will be incorporated, usually a special purpose vehicle. And this special purpose vehicle requires also funds to construct the new asset. Let's see why actually people do a due diligence. So this is some quotes from different research that has been done on mergers and acquisitions, and you can see that the failure rates are actually pretty high. The majority of the acquisitions actually fail, and fail must be understood that it means that it does not increase the shareholder value, but it may actually destroy shareholder value. So this is a large percentage, and of course, a due diligence, a proper due diligence may help to mitigate these failures and to increase the success rate. Of course, it's important to understand that a proper due diligence cannot assure that a merger or an acquisition will succeed, but it may definitely help. And looking on the internet for some of the quotes that you find in these newspapers, it's obvious that and it's the empirical evidence of the studies that are mentioned above. Let's see when a due diligence needs to be done. So remember that we have two different types of transactions: an merger and acquisition transaction, also called M&A, and a project finance transaction. And this slide shows a typical process for a merger and acquisition. It starts at the left-hand side with a M&A strategy. So this is a definition of the strategy and the criteria that a company develops to assure, to make a decision on which companies it could acquire. It may, for instance, be the level of risk that it's willing to take. Well, after this has been set, they go into a target screening phase where they identify possible candidates that they can acquire. Well, once a target company has been selected, you move into a deal evaluation phase. And this is also the part where the due diligence takes place. And so during this phase, the specific target that has been selected will be evaluated. It will be researched. The relevant risks will be identified. And at the end, of course, a valuation will take place, which will determine the bid that the company will make to acquire the other company. Well, then they move into the negotiation and closing phase, also called the transaction phase, in which the financing is done, the capital is being raised, and the contracts are made up. And this is actually the part where the due diligence has been finished already. And finally, the last step is the integration, where the one company is integrated into the other company. And of course, the failure rates that I mentioned on the previous slide, they also relate to this last step, whether the integration will be successful or not. So this is the phase for a due diligence under an M&A transaction. And if we move to a project finance transaction, it would look more like this. So for project financing, a new asset or a new infrastructure will be constructed for which a special company will be incorporated. This company exists for the sole purpose of constructing and operating the asset that is being created. And this company may require additional financing, for instance, from lenders, banks in the form of loans. And these banks, they may require due diligence because they want to know what they are spending their money on. And of course, they want to make sure that they are being repaid. So the due diligence phase could start very early from permitting, but could also be done during contracting. And most of the time you see that it's preceding the financing phase. This black line actually shows the project life cycle, where you can see that the red line shows that in the early stages, the project absorbs gas because it's being constructed, and that's where the loans are required for. And then during the operations, it generates gas, and that allows also to repay the loan, the interest and the principal. And of course, you could have risks in both phases, and we will come back to that later on in the presentation. So we now understand that the people who are investing or providing funds to companies require a due diligence, but we can dive a little bit further into this to show you which type of investors there are. So who requires a due diligence? So I've made a distinction into three separate type of parties that could require a due diligence. The first one are the industrial parties, we have financial parties, and finally we have public parties. So industrial parties are the ones that have a similar core business as the project that is being undertaken or the other company that they acquire. If we look at the energy industry, for instance, we see that they are usually asset owners and that they can provide capital in the form of equity, so they become shareholders, but they also provide know-how because they are operating in the same business. They also bring in knowledge into the project. And this may give them a dual role where they provide both the money and the funding, or also do the operation or act as suppliers. If we move to the second category, we have the financial parties. And you could say that the financial parties are primarily seeking a return on the investments. This could be banks who provide loans, but it can also be investment funds or pension funds or insurance companies that have capital and that they want to make a return on. So this group can both provide equity, where they become shareholders of the company, which is something you see, for instance, with insurance companies or pension funds, but they can also provide debt in the form of loans, and that's usually done by banks. And if it's a large investment, you could also see that banks partner with other banks and they form a loan syndicate, which provides the loan with several banks at once. The third parties are the public parties. And these parties, they really want to realize public works. So these are, for instance, the local governments and municipalities. Their focus is usually less on the return or on providing know-how, but they more strive for the soft outcomes such as job creation or increasing the livability of a city. And they can also be involved, of course, because they can grant concessions to different parties. So these are in a very broad overview the types of parties that can require a due diligence. And I think it's now good to have a look at what a due diligence process itself looks like. The first key characteristics, I would say, is the organization of a due diligence project. Usually you have the project sponsor, which is one of the investors that we showed on the previous slide, who hires a coordinating bank or a leading bank to do the project management and the financial modeling and valuation during the due diligence phase. And the coordinating bank will coordinate various functional work streams, you could say. These are listed on these on the slides, and these are the functional work streams that we see most often. Starting on the left-hand side, we have the accounting or the financial work stream, which is done usually by the accounting companies, accounting advisors, and they have a look at the books of the company that they want to acquire. So they scrutinize the historical statements and they look for whether there are any accounting tricks being applied and assess the quality of the earnings. A separate work stream, which is closely related to the accounting work stream and is usually also done by an accounting firm, is the tax work stream. And in the tax work stream, there is a check on whether there's, of course, a compliance with the tax laws, but they could also look for opportunities to see if it's possible to reduce the taxes after the acquisition, for instance. The third work stream is a legal work stream, which is usually done by a legal advisor, so a law firm, and they look into the ownership of the company and whether there's an exposure to, for instance, liabilities, and whether there are ongoing or potential litigations that may impact the company that is being acquired. So then we have the three last work streams on the right, and I've made them a different color because that's the scope that DNVGL can cover. And of course, it also flavors a bit this presentation. So I thought it would be helpful to explain it to you. The first one is the regulatory work stream. This only goes for companies or projects that are regulated. And during the regulatory work stream, we would assess the regulatory framework, whether there are any changes in the regulatory framework to be expected, how the regulation allows the company to make money. And this is all input into the financial modeling, which is being done by the bank in the eventual valuation. Another part or work stream is the commercial or market work stream, which would have a look at the market where the company is operating in. So it would have an assessment of the historic demand, but also would make an estimate of future demand for its products, as it will determine the revenues that the company is able to make in the future. It will look into the existing contracts that the company has with, for instance, suppliers or off-takers. And finally, the last work stream is a technical or an environmental work stream. For an existing asset, the technical work stream would typically look at the condition of the assets and the maintenance of the asset that has been done on it. And for a new project which is being constructed, you would look at whether the technology that is planned to be put into place, whether it actually works or not. And the technical and environmental work stream, they are really on the cost side of the valuation. So if it's a very asset-rich company with a lot of physical assets, we would also make a CAPEX estimate for the future or an OPEX plan to see what the expenditures are in the future and how much needs to be invested in this company. So this is a very generic overview, I would say, of the different work stream and the organization of a due diligence project. There can be other work streams which we do not see that often, but you could, for instance, have a research and development work stream or a HR or organizational work stream as well. Then I think it's good to have a look at the actual process. So how do these different work streams cooperate with each other and how is it structured in time? So what does the typical process look like? So I've put a small schematic on this slide to show you what the different activities are that occur during a due diligence. And again, some of the characteristics. So first of all, as you can see, the characteristics is that it's a staged process. So there are different phases. We usually see a minimum of 2 phases, as in this slide, where a first phase is being done in just 2 weeks, where in the end a red flag report, as it is called, is being drafted. And the red flag report provides an overview of the major risks that require a further scrutiny into the second phase where the final due diligence report is being made. If you can see and look at the timeline, there's 2 weeks for a red flag report, so it's a very short throughput time, which also results in very tight deadlines. Other aspects that are very typical in due diligence phase, for a technical due diligence where you want to have an understanding of the condition of the assets, it's very common that there are site visits or inspections, so that technical expert will actually visit the company and the assets that they operate, and that they can get an idea of what the condition is of these assets. For work streams which do not deal with technical assets, for instance, the legal work stream or the accounting work stream, expert sessions can be organized where you would have a session with the target company's counterparts to address questions and to get an understanding of the way the company is being operated and to clarify certain things. Another process which is very typical within this due diligence project is a so-called Q&A process. And a Q&A process is a structured way to ask questions to the target company. So each of the work streams submit questions to the target company through the coordinating bank, and the target company will answer these questions also in an official manner. Finally, within these different work streams that we have and with the coordinating bank, there are very regular and plenary advisory calls and meetings where the crucial points, usually the risks, are being discussed and whether it's checked if there's a necessity to coordinate between the work streams. For instance, the commercial work stream will have a look at the existing contracts. So it would look at what prices are there, what are the quantities, what is the duration of the contract. But of course, also the legal work stream would have a look at this contract, and they would look at certain clauses and whether there's a possibility to opt out of the contract by the off-takers. And in that case, the commercial work stream and the legal work stream should work together to get a clear picture on what the situation is. Well, all this requires, of course, a lot of information. And for this, a virtual data room is usually being set up. I think it's wise to spend some time to discuss what a virtual data room is. So a virtual data room is actually a website, a very secure website, which is being used to distribute the documents and the information of the target company. Usually preceding the due diligence, the target company has included all these documents, has filled this data room with the relevant documents, and has structured it along the different work streams that there are. So there is a section for the financials, there's a section for the legal, there's a section for the technical, which all contains relevant documents. There is one piece of information which is crucial in a due diligence, and this is the confidential information memorandum, or simply the information memorandum. And the information memorandum, you can view this as an extensive, almost brochure with the most important information about the target company. And this brochure, this information memorandum, is made by the company which is up for sale. And it's also being distributed to all the parties that are interested in buying the company. Usually it spans more than 100 pages, which is not uncommon. And it provides a very structured overview of the sector in which the company is operating, what are the market trends, how the company views the developments within the sector where it is operating. Of course, it will be an introduction into the company itself. So what is the organizational structure? What is the legal structure? What is the history of the company? Again, if it's a very asset-rich company with a lot of physical assets, it will provide an overview of the different assets that are in place. And there will also be legal information. a very important part again is the financial overview or the business plan of the company, in which the company has drafted a plan for the future with the cost it's required to make, with the revenue it's expected to make, and this will be input into the valuation of the bank by the buying company. And finally, the information memorandum can also contain other information such as information about the HR, the organization, key personnel. Usually you'll see that the management is being introduced, and of course it contains health and safety information or the statistics that apply to this. So all this information is put into this virtual data room, and these virtual data rooms, they are usually offered by specialized providers. So I've listed 3 on the left side, and they offer the services to have a very secure website where this is being hosted on. So this is in a very short and a very nutshell what a due diligence process looks like and for what's being done. And I think it's also interesting to look at what are the typical risks that a company or a potential a buyer, for instance, would look for. So if we assume that there is a project financing, a new project is being developed, for instance, a district heating network or a district heating generation plant, and a bank is asked to invest or to provide a loan, what are the typical risks that such a company or such a bank would look at? The first type of risk, they precede the operation of this district heating plant. So these are the risks that occur during the construction. And these risks, they relate, for instance, to the planning of the district heating plant or the technology that is being used and the construction of the district heating plant. So questions that could be asked, whether the time schedule can be made, whether the budget that has been estimated is sufficient, and if the technology that is being used is actually fit for purpose. So these are the type of risks typically that a bank will look at. And a way to mitigate these risks is to allocate these risks to a contractor. It's a good principle to allocate risk to those parties that are in the best position to manage and to assure that the risk does not come up. And of course, in this phase, this would be a contractor. And the bank will look at contracts. So whether there is a contract in place with a contractor and what the contract looks like. And usually a turnkey contract is favored. In this turnkey contract, the contractor will get a maximum budget and it will need to pay penalties if it's over the time schedule. And there are, of course, also performance standards being applied. And in this, in such a contract that satisfies the bank that it can be sure that the risks that there are during the construction are mitigated. So once the plant has been constructed, it starts the operation, and then a new set of risks occur. So these are the the post-completion risk or the operating risks. And these risks, they relate to, for instance, the supply of the raw materials. So let's say the district heating plant uses biomass to generate heat. There's a risk, of course, that there's a shortage of biomass or that the price of biomass skyrocket and you will have a lot of costs. On the other hand, you can also have demand, so that heat or electricity is being sold and that there is not enough demand for this heat or that the prices are very low. The district heating plants need to be maintained and need to be put into operation, and if it is being not maintained in a proper way, it can run into problems and issues which, for instance, result into the non-delivery of the heat and so on. For these type of risks, again, the bank or the one that is putting in the funds will look at the agreements that are in place. For a supply, you would have a so-called put or pay agreement, with suppliers in which you have a fixed price, a fixed quantity, and a fixed quality to assure that in the district heating case, the biomass is always being supplied. For the operation, you would have a designated operator, which you would have a service level agreement. And the service level agreement, it determines the key performance indicators to which the operator should comply with. And if it's not performing up to standards, it will need to pay additional penalties, which is of course an incentive to keep the plant in operation to the appropriate standards. And finally, for demand, there can be so-called take or pay agreements with large off-takers, in which a predetermined price and a predetermined volume is being set in order to mitigate this demand risk. Of course, if you have a lot of small customers, for instance, retail customers, it's not possible to have an agreement with all of these parties. So in that case, you cannot mitigate this risk. Finally, there is a counterparty risk. We see that all of the risks are being mitigated through agreements, but of course, there's also a risk that the party with which you have an agreement is not able to comply with the obligation it has, for instance, the payments. That is counterparty risk, and you can assure, or you need to assure, that these counterparties are financially healthy and that you have one-to-one agreements. So in case they are in default, they can be replaced. And this is also something that a bank will look at. Finally, there are a set of risks which span the entire life cycle of a project. And these are what is called the life cycle risks. So these can be natural disasters or environmental risks, for instance, public opposition or contamination of the site. And for these type of risks, usually you can have an insurance policy. So again, in this case, the bank will look whether this insurance policy is in place. There are political risks, which could emerge. The first event that is on this slide that is expropriation. Well, that might not happen in Europe that very often or very frequently, but a change in regulations could happen. For instance, if the district heating plant is being regulated, so its prices are being determined, and if there is a change in regulation, then this results in the risk that the revenues that the district heating plant can make are insufficient. And such a change in law cannot be insured. The last set of risks which span the entire life cycle of the project are so-called macroeconomic risks. So these have to do with exchange rate risks. So you're buying in one currency and you're selling in the other currency. Inflation risks, whether, for instance, the supply or the raw material is has a different inflation rate than, for instance, the products that you sell. And interest rate risk. So if you have debt and that is based on a floating interest rate, a change in interest rate may then increase, of course, the payments to repay the debt that you have. So a mitigating option for these would be to hedge these risks through, for instance, derivative contracts. During a due diligence, I think it's important to mention that these contracts are not checked as a checkbox. So it's not a checklist that they will go through, but they will actually look into these agreements and then scrutinize these agreements with the commercial work stream and in the legal work stream to see what the implications can be. So it goes in the due diligence, it goes a lot deeper than just a checklist for these type of agreements. I think that it's probably now interesting to look into some actual examples of due diligence work that we have done and to provide you with some lessons learned from these examples. And for that, I would like to give the words to my colleague, Bue Pruiksma, also from DNVGL, to discuss these examples with you.
Yes, thanks, Maurice. Good morning. Hope you all can hear me. So thanks for that nice explanation, Maurice. About due diligence. My name is Biwa Pruiksma, also working for DNVGL and currently acting also as business lead due diligence. Before we will move to the examples, I think we can already do a short recap of what has been discussed so far. Basically that we learned that there is no standard due diligence, no standard, well, there are no official standards, but that almost every due diligence covers the same scope items. But every due diligence is unique in its own way because there are a number of factors that differ per project. For example, what target are we talking about? As you can imagine, some, for instance, grid companies like electricity network companies and gas network companies are being regulated in most countries. Well, often, and also a regulatory due diligence needs to be performed. But you can also think of, well, what type of technology are we talking about, which influences the scope of the due diligence. Another one is the size and the complexity of the transaction. So are we talking about just one asset, just one project that is being developed, or are we talking about a whole portfolio of different assets and different technologies within one big holding company that is part of the transaction? A third one is the level of risk perceived by the financing companies and their experience. As this differs, for instance, between banks and investors or infrastructure companies and utilities or developers. For instance, in general, banks have a lower risk appetite than equity investors. Then the fourth one is the nature of the transaction. As Maurice already explained, there's a difference between project finance. So you want to finance a project that is being developed, and a merger and acquisition due diligence. Because as part of an M&A due diligence, you are talking about mostly operational assets. And this also relates to the maturity of the project, as George explained in the beginning. So I think for now it's time to move to some of the examples. And we will present you 2 project finance examples and 1 M&A due diligence example. All examples are from the Netherlands, as a lot of our work is also in the Netherlands, also globally, but well, we are based in the Netherlands. The first project finance example relates to the electrical scooter called Felix, which is being introduced in the larger cities in the Netherlands. We were contracted and contacted by the developer and by ABN AMRO to perform a technical due diligence. And the main goal of the project was to identify risks from a technical perspective. So does it work? How to check check the quality of the battery system. That was the main focus of the technical due diligence, as the battery system is the main critical component, and so far there was not that much experience with electrical scooters. And the ultimate objective of the project was for Felix to get finance from the banks, to be able to realize their rollout strategy, and to be able to realize production facilities to be able to manufacture the electrical scooters. As part of this due diligence, we looked at a number of scope items. So we mainly looked at the technical integrity and performance of the battery system. We also looked into operations and maintenance agreements and the planning for the O&M. We also looked into the financial model, and we checked to what extent the electric scooter and the main components were compliant with several standards. So as a result, after 2 months of study, we were able to confirm that the technical concept of Felix complied with the industry standards, and that the performance of the battery system and the technical integrity, so for instance the lifetime and the degradation, are sufficient. So this was important information to the bank, because the bank is only willing to provide finance in case the perceived risk is low and any potential risk are mitigated. So we were able to provide confirmation of the planned rollout of the electrical scooter, and we identified any barriers for the funding phase. And what we learned from this project is that you need expert insight on important technical topics, and in addition, what is also key is that a documented approach of all your information that you have as a developer is very important. So of course you will, as a developer, you will have a lot of information, but it's also critical that this information is managed in a good way, that you have it available, and that you are able to share it in case of a due diligence. Because as Maurice already explained, information will be shared often through a data room, and the information should be available in a transparent way to all involved parties. And at the moment, Felix has started the further rollout of the electrical scooter in the Netherlands, but also in other countries. So then another example, also project finance, which is the Lightyear 1 electrical vehicle. And what is quite cool about this car is that it has a solar PV roof. So solar PV panels are integrated in the roof. We performed this technical due diligence for the developer called Atlas Technologies. The duration of the project was about 3 months, so a bit longer than a standard M&A due diligence process, and that is what you often see in project finance, that there's a bit more time. We were asked to provide a third-party review and again to identify potential risks and to provide mitigating measures. And also here, the ultimate objective was to get finance to be able to build a production facility, to be able to build and produce the Lightyear 1 cars. So far there are a few prototypes, but they want to scale up production. As part of the technical due diligence, we looked at the technology, so at the solar roof, and we looked at the battery system, also to store the energy that is required. We looked at the inverter, also a critical component, and we looked at the conversion through the in-wheel motors. Next to technology, we also assessed production and operations. Is the planning feasible? How are things arranged? How is supply, etc. And we also looked at the organization. So is there a sound management in place? What is the capability of the whole organization? Are the people, are they competent? Well, that's what we looked at as part of the organization. And then about the results. Also here, after a few months of study, we could confirm the suitability of the car, of the main components. So the performance of the solar roof, of the battery system, and of the in-wheel motors were in line with what we would expect. And also we assessed that the organizational capabilities were in place. And as a result, financing was available for Lightyear 1 to be able to scale up their production. As lessons learned, again, it shows that the technical due diligence is critical to be able to get finance. Technical due diligence is required to be able to check any claims that are made by the developer, so by Lightyear 1, and by checking those claims, we can provide comfort towards the lenders or the banks. We also got some insights in the market of the technologies utilized, and also on the organization, we learned that a good plan for increasing the organization is required and was in place, and also for the manufacturing, as they want to scale up rapidly, and they have started preparation for the production of the Lightyear 1. Then the third example is about the charging infrastructure company Allego in the Netherlands. Well, at least it was in Dutch ownership until a few years ago. So this is a merger and acquisition due diligence, where we were hired by Alliander, which is an electrical or an electricity distribution network company within the Netherlands. And as part of Alliander, they have some spin-offs, some commercial spin-offs, which is not part of their regulated activities. And at some point then they decide, okay, we should sell sell those entities. And one of those was Allego, as I mentioned, an EV charging infrastructure company, and we were hired by Alliander to perform the technical and environmental vendor due diligence. And at that time, Allego had about 3,000 EV and also electrical bus chargers across 4 countries in Europe. So, and in this project, it's a vendor due diligence, and vendor, you can have a buyer due diligence and a vendor due diligence. So there are 2 sides in a transaction, a buy side and a sell side. You can compare it when you to the situation when you, for instance, would like to sell or buy your house. And in this case, we were on the sell side, and as the sell side, you want to be sure that you will get a good price for your asset, but you also want to be sure that there are no unpleasant surprises towards any potential buyers, and that there are no skeletons in the closet, so to speak. As part of the technical due diligence, we looked at also here at the organization, at the technology, at maintenance, and at the lifetime of the infrastructure. And the focus was on the charges. This was the main component. This is their core activity, charging EVs. So we looked at all the different charges and also at the performance of the charges. In the end, after a few months, I think 3 to 4 months, and that's typical for vendor due diligence, because then you work with the sell side, and then in general you have a bit more time to perform the due diligence, because you are closely working together, you have access to all information, and well, then often it takes a bit more time, so we have a bit of an advantage compared to the buy side. But we were able to provide an overview of any identified technical and operational risks, which had an influence on the asset value. And we suggested a number of mitigating measures to tackle those. And also here, as lessons learned, availability of data was key, and especially for this project, because all of those charging poles, they lead to a lot of data, and not only data gathering is important, but you also should have clear structures and procedures in place to manage the data and to be able to analyze that data, and also to be able to have the competences to interpret the data analysis. This was important to be able to say something about the performance. And after a few months, almost 2 years ago, Alliander completed the sale, and Allego was sold to a French investment company, Meridiam. But the Allego EV charging infrastructure is still in place. So then we jump to the conclusions. Maurice has provided you an comprehensive overview of due diligence in general. What is due diligence? What does it mean? How does it work? And we provided you some examples. And now we would like to conclude. And I think we can say that, well, banks and investors, they require certainty. They don't like unforeseen risks. but they like certainty, and if there are any potential risks, then they would like to see, okay, how can those risks be mitigated, and therefore a due diligence is required. And as mentioned, a due diligence is performed by both sides, by both the buy side and by the sell side. It's also important that all involved parties have access to the same amount of information. Due diligence is characterized by a multidisciplinary approach, as Maurice explained, dependent on the asset and the size and the involved parties. A number of due diligence work streams can be in place, like the commercial, like the technical, like the regulatory, etc. And often you are dealing with short throughput times, although this depends on the nature of the due diligence. So are you working for the sell side, then in general there's a bit more time, and often if you're working on the buy side, then there's not that much time. Then it will needs to be done in about 2 to 4, 5 weeks in general. And in case we are working for developers, then the standard throughput time is about 2-3 months. As I just already mentioned, the availability and the provision of information is key to all involved parties. And that also means that as a lessons learned, we experience that every time. Well, it's very important that you prepare your information in a structured way, that you have the information available, that it is documented, so that it is relatively easy to share in case of a due diligence. Another lesson is that, well, as also already mentioned, a due diligence effort, it depends on the nature of the project. So it depends on the size of the asset. It depends on the complexity of the asset. And in general, for lower maturity level projects like startups, so often when we are involved in project finance, we simply can say that we check the question, does it work? And then we check any claims that are being made by the developer with regards to the underlying technology. But next to the technology, we also can conclude that a thorough and a realistic and a substantiated business plan is important. Finally, a way to mitigate any risks is via agreements, as Maurice also already explained. For instance, you can think of contracts, so contracts for O&M, or contracts for EPC, so engineering, procurement, and construction. You can also think of permits or land lease agreements, or agreements regarding the supply of materials or parts. You can also think of your route to market. So this is all very important to think of, and which you can include in your business plan. So that was the presentation from our side, from DNVGL. I would like to hand over now again, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Now it's time for questions from the audience. Please, if you have a question, write it on the chat box or raise your hand and we will try to unmute you.
George, so there are already some questions we have in our question box. So the first one, I don't know if you see that already.
I'm not seeing for some reason.
Yeah, I'll read those out loud then. So the first three questions were, will the presentation be shared afterwards?
Yes, yes, the presentation will be shared with you afterwards.
And also the question how it will be shared. Yes, we will send it with the via email as a link, so you can download it for yourself as a PDF version. The next one is how much kilogram of CO2 savings do you target for $1 million investment in green energy versus retrofit projects?
I do not have an answer for that question. I'm not sure whether any of my colleagues have a question, an answer for that question, whether it's very technical and probably depends on the types of projects.
Maybe Bue or Maurice?
Yeah, maybe I can try to answer this or provide my thoughts on this. What we have noticed is that if you're looking at these sustainable projects, that most of the investors, for instance, the equity investors, they already come from the same type of business, and that they're not specifically looking into a CO2 savings per €1 million or so invested, but it more aligns with the business that they are already operating. For instance, we can have a look at a natural gas business and biogas. And in this case, companies that come from the natural gas industry, they will be interested in investing in biogas because this provides them a strategic outlook. And in this sense, they're not specifically looking at a kilogram of CO2 savings per million invested, but simply a let's say a strategic outlook onto the future, so an existence of their company. And I'm not sure how this is in the electricity industry, but I can imagine that there's no specific indicator that defines these such a level.
Okay. Yes, thanks, Maurice. I can add to that. Bue here. Yes, so it's not that we as DNVGL that we have that we set a target for CO2 emission reduction. In case a developer or the company that will hire us make some kind of claim regarding the CO2 emission reduction, then we will check that. And so we are hired to perform a review. Next to that, in general, as part of due diligence projects, we look indeed at environmental issues, so we can cover environmental scope, including emissions. And I think in general, we often look at things like, for example, equator principles or other standards. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so there's another question. Can you say anything about DD challenges when it comes to larger complex city development investment cases?
Again, I will give the floor to my colleagues from the DNVGL.
Yeah, so I think the challenges are, first of all, time-wise. I mean, in any case, there's a short throughput time, and as the definition that I showed early on in the presentation, you want to have a very comprehensive understanding of the business that you are investing in. Secondly is the provision of information. I think this is very a key element, that the people who want to commit money or funds to such an investment, they want to have certainty, and this requires a lot of information. They want things to be on paper. Sometimes we see that people make claims, but they can only prove this narratively instead of having things on paper, etc. And this usually is not sufficient for a bank to commit money to such an endeavor. So I think that's one of the key elements that should be in place.
Yes, thank you, Maurice. And I have to agree, and also from the experience on EIP-SCC and the call that we have for a matchmaking event where we had projects that were presented, there was a lack of information. Although there was not, we were not required information as we require for a due diligence, or not even close to that. But even the project had insufficient information. So what we would recommend is that also to gather all the information, as was mentioned on the last slide on the lessons learned, sufficient information and well documented. That's really relevant. And as you mentioned, a realistic business plan also.
Okay. Perfect. There's another question. Is there any effort to standardize the methodology to due diligence? And can this be done through ISO or CEN or projects such as Investor Confidence Project?
I can go through that one because I was involved on the Investor Confidence Project. For instance, the Investor Confidence Project is a part of the process. It's on the underwriting phase. It's a standard that will help to develop the energy efficiency projects, not all the projects. The tricky part here, and this is from my experience, and then I will give the floor again to the NVGL, is that all projects are very different, even when they follow some standards, because as was mentioned, due diligence covers not only the technical part, but can covers legal, regulatory, all the other frameworks. And this opens space to a lot of difference between projects. And so it's not easy to standardize, but yeah, I don't know about your experience.
Yeah, maybe I can add something. I think that I would say implicitly our experience with working for different investment banks that usually coordinate these due diligence efforts, that they all tend to follow the same procedure. So they're all familiar with the concept that we explained about Q&A processes, the red flag processes, expert sessions. These are all very standardized in a due diligence process, but more in an implicit manner than very explicitly. I think that if you go into more detail, and indeed what George has been saying, that a lot of these due diligence processes, it's really a research into a company, and then different things just pop up that require the attention. So that could be a legal claim that is an important one. It could be a regulatory claim. It could be lacking information about the asset condition. And this will also steer during the process where the effort lies from the different advisors and the investment bank. So I would say implicitly the process has been streamlined in the industry, and perhaps it's not even necessary to make a standardized process for it already, because most of the people that are working on this have this common view and this common vocabulary about due diligence studies.
Thank you. Any other questions, Sabine?
I see there are no further questions. Sorry, I was muted. So no further questions. There is a raised hand from Chandra Kumar. Maybe if you have your questions answered, because that was the how much kilogram of CO2 savings question, maybe you can unraise your hand, but if it's still not answered, or if you have any other question, I would unmute you. So I just wait if the hand raising symbol stays. Okay, then I unmute Chandra. Just a second. Let's see if this works. Okay, my colleague Vanessa, maybe you can unmute Chandra.
I don't see her on my list.
In the attendees list. Okay, maybe Chandra, you can write your question in the question box again.
Sorry about this inconvenience.
I see her now. I will unmute her now. I can't because she is self-muted and I can't unmute her.
Okay, then maybe just type your question in that question box. Yes, sorry for the inconvenience. There is another raised hand. It is from Vanya Histrova. So maybe you can also write your question if you have one in the question box. So at the moment, no one, so I don't see any new questions.
I have one question for my colleagues from the VGL in the meantime. It's about the confidentiality of the information, because you have told that you have this virtual data room, but still there are several documents that usually one of the parties don't want to share, or at least to leave that document in these types of data rooms, and requires you to visit the site and to see the documents there. Is this very often common or not so common in your case?
In my experience, most of the information is indeed being shared. I can remember actually one due diligence study that we did, which was for an Austrian company, and the due diligence or the information that was required, they were contracts, so commercial contracts that this company had with other companies, and they of course also contained confidential information, not just about the target company, but also about the company with which the target company has these contracts. And therefore it was required to actually visit this company, and they had set up not a virtual data room, but an actual data room, so a room with all the files in it on paper. You were not allowed to take any mobile phones with you so you could make autographs, just a pen and paper. And initially, you were also required to be admitted to the Austrian the Bar Association. So you needed to be an Austrian lawyer before you could access this room. Now, in the end, they lifted this because it was not necessary, but there were very strict policies indeed to look at these contracts. So it may happen that not everything is being shared on this virtual data room, but that you actually need to visit the company itself, where you go into a physical room and then look at the actual documents that could occur.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Chandra posted the question, is there a standard tool for due diligence specifically for green finance?
As it was mentioned before, I don't think that there is, at least I'm not aware of any standard tool for green finance. What there is in the market now, but it's a bit different, it's the taxonomy that has been taking, that was released, the report on taxonomy that will help to understand what types of business are or not considered green, and that will then connect with this due diligence process, because as part of the due diligence, probably you will have to check whether this could be considered sustainable finance or not. I don't know if you guys have any experience on this.
Buet, can you take this question?
Yes, I can add to this answer. So indeed, as mentioned before, just in general for due diligence, the way of working is more or less standardized. So the process of the due diligence, as Maurice also explained, the Q&A, also often the way of reporting is the same, and indeed most of the involved advisors, they use the same vocabulary. For specific for green loans, I think this is not that different, but what is different is that well, the green loans, they how to say it, in this case the requirements and the terms and conditions from the financing organizations, or from a bank, for instance, will be different compared to normal loans. But the process of doing the due diligence will not be very different. It just means that the risk appetite is a bit different, and this is up to the financer.
Thank you.
Okay, there was a comment also from one of our attendees that there are several platforms for DD standards, as for example Green Match. So everyone can maybe also look further in that. So, and another question posted, is there or will there be a protocol for setting up a smart city? I think something like a guideline, a standard table to guide the process of implementation, or something tell us what to registrate and what to report in order to review the efficiency, e.g. financial. That's from Guido Donato Moser.
Okay. I don't think that there is there are some work on standardization regarding smart cities, and also there are if you dig into our website on the marketplace and skis, you will find several roadmaps that can guide you through the process of developing a smart city. A smart city guidance package, for instance, it's a document that we have, and I can then point you at the end of this webinar. I can email you and point you to that, where you can find all the information that is required, and there are some checklists that they can support you on that process. And I know that there are some standards that are now made available on this topic.
Okay. Yeah, here Guido is thanking us, and here sent the link on Green Match AG, so on the company he proposed, so we can also yeah, have a look there. So it's on LinkedIn, Green Match AG. So at the moment there are no further questions. Has any of the attendees others?
Since we are reaching also the time limit of the event, I would move to the next slide. And if you have any questions, you still have time to put it on the chat box, and we will answer you by email. Okay, and we will follow up. I just want to invite you all for our next webinar that will take place on the 7th of May. It will be about standardized risk assessment. So it will be made in a partnership with the Launch project and Horizon 2020 project that is focusing on this standardized risk assessment protocol. So we will talk about risk assessment that is really related with what we have been talking here today. Then we will have a third webinar on public procurement that will take place in June. We will end up this series of webinars with a masterclass focusing on project bankability, also taking place in June. We will let you know about the dates soon, so please just submit or just register on our newsletter and you will get all the information. Also, if you have good suggestions of webinars that you think that could be presented, that you think that is a need in the market, just let us know and we can try to work that and try to develop that that webinar, finding experts to present it. Just as a final word, I want to thank all my colleagues from the panel. Thank you so much for this this great presentation. I hope you all enjoy it. Stay safe. And yeah, and we'll see you on our next webinar.
Thank you so much, George. Also from the from us, from EIP-SCC, thank you. And also for the newsletter, if you sign up, you can stay tuned for our next matchmaking, which will be a matchmaking in June. And we will come up with the dates as soon as possible and can share this with you also. In May, there is a big newsletter coming up.
Thank you.
Thank you from our side, and goodbye. Thank you.